Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to be heard by living ears. It begins in silence, but it ends with screams. In the autumn of 1900, a team of surveyors cut a path through the forests of Tennessee, carving ground for the railroads. Their shovels struck not rock, not root, but something far more fragile. When they unearthed the first wooden box, no larger than a shoemaker's kit, the air filled with the clawing stench of decay. Inside were bones, perfectly formed, impossibly small, the remains of a newborn child, and then another, and another, an entire field of shallow graves hidden beneath the leaves, as though someone had been burying secrets in the earth itself. That graveyard did not belong to the church. It was not consecrated, not marked, not remembered. It was erased deliberately, an attempt to silence a horror too black to speak aloud. But silence cannot bury truth forever, because the bones belonged to a generation of infants taken between 1837 and 1843, all tied to one woman. She had been celebrated as a healer, a savior, even a saint. The townspeople called her the Angel of Providence Bluffs. But history remembers her by another name. She was a midwife, and she was a killer. A woman who delivered children into this world with one hand and sold their bodies with the other. Her name was Anora Good, and the story you're about to hear isn't just about her. It's about the power of trust, twisted into a weapon. It's about the way institutions, church, medicine, wealth, even science itself, can hide behind masks of virtue while feeding on the innocent. And it's about you. Because once you understand how far this rot goes, you'll never look at history or the world around you the same way again. Now, let us descend. Providence Bluffs, Tennessee, in the year 1837 was a portrait of contradiction. Wealth was painted in white-columned mansards, lawns that rose above the Cumberland River, built on cotton, tobacco, and the blood of the enslaved. But survival was fragile. Disease could burn through a household in a single night. A newborn's cry often ended in silence before the month was done. Families buried children as often as they baptized them. And in the center of this chaos was Anora Good. A widow in her 50s with gray threaded hair and weathered hands, she was known as a woman of mercy. She could ease fevers with herbs. She could calm a laboring mother with nothing more than her voice. She would work for money from the rich or bread and preserves from the poor. To the town she was constant, reliable, her very presence a promise of survival in a world where survival was never promised. They never questioned her. Because who would? Who suspects the midwife, the woman you invite into your most private chambers, the woman who holds life in her palms, of being anything but holy? But the truth is this: the greatest predators are always cloaked in trust. Wolves wear sheep's wool, devils wear crosses, and killers wear aprons stained with birth blood. Anora Good's transformation did not begin in luxury. Before Providence Bluffs called her an angel, she was Anora Mayhew, the wife of a tenant farmer, a woman who had buried her own baby in a pauper's grave after the child withered in her arms during a Tennessee winter. She had no money for medicine, no silver for milk, no coffin for the grave. That moment, watching her daughter die while the wealthy women of town nursed plump, healthy infants in lace-trimmed cradles, was the forge that hardened her soul. Some women break under grief, others sharpen. And Anora sharpened into something else, something colder, something that looked at the fat, fortunate children of Providence Bluffs and decided their survival was stolen luck, that the wealthy owed her something, that their children could be taxed. And so, as she trained in midwifery, she discovered opportunity. Every birth brought her into the heart of those households, into the bedrooms of power, into the cradles of the elite. She could touch what was most precious and decide whether it would remain in the world or vanish into shadow. Her method was perfect, subtle, hidden in plain sight. In a world where infant death was as common as rainfall, who would question another tiny coffin in the earth? She didn't need knives or fire. She only needed timing, a cloth, a bitter tincture, a practiced hand. Then, while the mother rested in exhaustion and the family gave thanks to God, Anora carried the infant to a quiet corner of the room. "I'll tend the little one," she would whisper with infinite care. And in that private ritual, unseen, she made her choice. The poor families with their rough cabins and empty cupboards, their children usually survived her hands. She even refused payment sometimes, deepening her reputation as a saint of the downtrodden. But the rich, the ones with gold watches on their nightstands and silk sheets under their wives, their children died, quietly, consistently. And their bodies did not stay buried, because there was a market for flesh, a hunger hidden behind locked doors of medical schools, where young doctors dissected cadavers in the name of science. But the law only gave them criminals to cut apart, and there were never enough. So a black market thrived. Grave robbers sold corpses by lantern light, and anatomists paid dearly for what could not be purchased above ground. But infant bodies, those were priceless, rare, perfect specimens for the professors who craved to unlock the mysteries of early human development. Anora Good had found her economy, and in the shadows she found her partner, a resurrectionist who called himself Silas Croft, a man who trafficked in death, who saw bodies as merchandise. Together they formed an alliance. She supplied the harvest, and he supplied the coin. They met in abandoned cabins under moonless skies, exchanging bundles wrapped in oilcloth for purses of silver. It was the unholy marriage of vengeance and profit, and the town never suspected a thing, not until the bones were found decades later, hidden in the soil like teeth waiting for the day they would bite back through history. But tonight, you'll hear the rest. And as you hear it, you'll realize this isn't just one woman's evil, it's a pattern, a design, a template of power that repeats itself across centuries, a blueprint of how the powerful hide their crimes in plain sight, cloaked in virtue, shielded by trust. And before we're done, you'll see how it connects to the world you live in right now. Are you ready to keep going? Then follow me deeper. The birthing room of the 1840s was not the bright, sanitized chamber you might imagine today. It was dim, suffocating, often thick with the metallic scent of blood and sweat. Curtains drawn, lamps burning low, only women allowed, husbands pacing outside, servants whispering prayers. And at the center of this trembling circle was always the midwife. She was authority. She was ritual. She was power. Anora Good knew how to command that space, her voice a calm hum, her hands steady as stone. She could soothe the mother's agony with herbs, whispering prayers that sounded more like spells, her presence cloaking the room in trust. She held the most sacred responsibility imaginable, to deliver life itself. But her hands could deliver death just as easily, and no one dared question her. Understand the world she moved in. Childbirth was a battlefield. Infant mortality was not a statistic. It was the sound of silence after a baby's first cry. 1 in 3 newborns never saw their first birthday. A mother could bury half her children before she herself grew old. Death was accepted as God's will, cruel but inevitable. And Anora weaponized that acceptance. Her method was as simple as it was monstrous. She never killed a child outright in a way that could be seen. She crafted illusions of weakness. If a baby was small, she ensured it never drew a second breath. If a baby was strong, she whispered death into its body in ways only the herbs and her silence understood. Sometimes it was a bitter tincture slipped onto the lips, bitter as almonds, leaving only the faintest blue on the mouth. Sometimes it was a cloth, pressed just long enough to still the air before handing the infant back, swaddled in false serenity. Always, she chose her moment with surgical precision. While the women tended to the exhausted mother, Anora stood alone in the corner with the child. Her ritual was private, sacred only to her. She would murmur, "Rest now, dear. You've done the hard part. I'll see to the little one." And in that hidden space, she decided who would live and who would be wrapped for burial. It was never random. It was a calculation. The wealthy families of Providence Bluffs, the Pritchards, the Winthrops, the Cartwrights, were her chosen targets. For them, infant mortality struck with uncanny frequency. A mysterious wasting sickness, a sudden weakness in the night, always explained away, always accepted, because grief blinds the mind and trust blinds the eyes. But among the poor, the farmers, the blacksmiths, the widows with cabins of dirt floors, their babies thrived under Anora's care. She delivered them with gentleness, protected them fiercely, and often refused payment, claiming that helping a family in need was its own ritual. And the town, seeing this, wove her into legend, the angel of Providence Bluffs. But that was her camouflage, her mask. Because while the poor gave her loaves of bread and jars of preserves, the rich unknowingly funded her true purpose. Their infants became currency, wrapped in oilcloth, sold under moonlight to Silas Croft, the resurrectionist who supplied medical schools with bodies. The wealthy lost their heirs, while Anora's pockets filled with silver. Think of the genius of it. She turned the natural tragedies of her era into a business model. Every child she killed was hidden in the larger fabric of accepted fate. And because she balanced mercy for the poor with cruelty for the powerful, she was untouchable. No one suspected her. No one dared. But suspicion has a way of bleeding through cracks. It began, as all dangerous truths do, with whispers. Some women claimed they heard strange noises in the nursery when Anora sat alone with their newborns, a faint grinding sound like herbs crushed in a mortar, though no remedies were ever produced. Others remembered a bitter smell, sharp and almond-like, clinging to the swaddling cloths of the dead. But grief is a fog. Families smothered their doubts, telling themselves it was imagination, hysteria, or God's cruel will. Yet not everyone was blind. In 1843, a young doctor arrived in Providence Bluffs. Vance, trained in Philadelphia, steeped in the new sciences of pathology and statistics. He was not a man of folklore or faith. He was a man of numbers. And numbers do not lie. He saw Anora Good not as a saint, but as an anomaly. Her reputation for miraculous outcomes struck him as too perfect, too convenient. So he began to record. Births, deaths, families, midwives, a grim ledger of names, ages, social status, and results. He didn't know what he was hunting, but his instincts told him something was wrong, something festering beneath the polished veneer of Providence Bluffs. At first, his notes were merely curious observations, but as the months passed, the patterns began to emerge. Among the poor, Anora's record was almost supernatural. Babies lived, mothers thrived. A miracle worker, it seemed. But among the wealthy, the numbers flipped. The strongest, healthiest infants collapsed suddenly in the night. Deaths came so often, so consistently, that they could not possibly be chance. The doctor's ledger was whispering the truth, and he knew if he listened closely, the whispers would grow into screams. But Dr. Vance was only one man, and Anora Good was not alone. She had Silas Croft, the resurrectionist, to protect her secrets, to whisk away the bodies before anyone could ask questions. She had the church, blinded by her piety. She had the community, spellbound by her charity. She had an entire world conditioned to accept the deaths of children without question. And so the bones piled up, one grave after another, buried beneath leaves and silence. Here is the first lesson of Providence Bluffs. Evil rarely comes snarling, with blood on its teeth. It comes smiling, with clean hands. It cloaks itself in service, in charity, in holiness. It thrives where no one dares to look. And if you think that story belongs to the 1800s, you're already asleep, because the same pattern surrounds you now in different forms, wearing different masks. Institutions, leaders, even entire governments draped in white robes, claiming to heal, claiming to protect, while they harvest something far more valuable than flesh. But we'll come to that. For now, remember this. Every horror begins with trust, and every grave begins with Hence. By the spring of 1843, Elias Vance's ledger was no longer just a curiosity. It was an accusation. 2 years of careful notations had built a map of life and death across Providence Bluffs. And when he drew the line through Anora Good's work, the truth cut like a blade. The poor families, the blacksmiths, the tenant farmers, the washerwomen showed survival rates that defied belief. Children lived, mothers recovered, households thrived. But among the wealthy, the numbers twisted into something grotesque. More than half of the infants she delivered in the finest homes of the county were dead before their first month. Some never lived past their first night. These were not random tragedies, not chance, not God's will. This was something else. Vance stared at the pages of his ledger late into the night, the flicker of a single lamp illuminating the ink. Every column, every mark on the parchment whispered the same truth. The midwife's miracles and misfortunes were not miracles at all. They were mathematics, and the mathematics proved murder. But truth in numbers is useless if the world refuses to see, because to the people of Providence Bluffs, Anora Good was untouchable. She was the quiet figure who gathered herbs at dawn, the healer who worked for bread and not coin, the saint who comforted women in their darkest hour. Even in grief, the wealthy families thanked her. They blessed her name even as they buried their heirs. She was not merely trusted, she was worshipped, and that trust was her greatest weapon. Still, whispers began to seep into the cracks of grief. It started with the Pritchards. Their son had been born strong, a black-haired boy who seemed destined to outlive them all. For 2 days his cries were fierce, his body healthy. On the third night, Anora insisted on staying with the child so the exhausted mother could sleep. By dawn, the baby was dead. Anora explained it with solemn calm. A wasting sickness, a mysterious fever that strikes without warning. Her voice was soothing, her grief shared. The family believed her, or tried to. But in the mind of Eleanora Pritchard, the mother, doubt coiled like a serpent. She remembered waking in the night to an unfamiliar sound from the nursery. Not a baby's cry, but a rhythmic grinding, as though someone was crushing herbs in a mortar and pestle. She remembered the bitter, almond-like smell on her son's blankets. She remembered the faint blue on his lips. She whispered these doubts to her husband. But grief had broken him into silence, and pride chained him to denial. He told her it was madness, the delirium of sorrow. He forbade her from ever speaking of it again, especially about Anora, whom he revered as a holy woman. So Eleanora buried her child, and with him she buried her questions. But the questions did not die. They spread, quietly, in hushed voices at markets and churchyards. Women compared the strange details of their losses. The noises, the smells, the way Anora insisted on tending the newborns alone in the corner, and always the same bitter aftertaste of doubt, unspoken but shared. And while the whispers grew, Anora's partnership with Silas Croft deepened into something ritualistic. Croft was not merely a supplier of cadavers. He was a man who lived among shadows, who trafficked in what society condemned yet secretly consumed. The medical schools in Nashville and beyond demanded specimens, fresh, untouched, human, and they paid dearly for them. To Croft, Anora was a treasure, a wellspring of the rarest commodity. Infant bodies, preserved not by grave soil, but by immediate death. Her deliveries were clean, her harvests perfect. Wrapped in oilcloth, smelling faintly of the herbs she buried them in, the infants were worth more than gold. Once a month, under the cover of a new moon, Anora walked the 5 miles through the forest to the abandoned trapper's cabin. Her basket was always the same, linens on top, death beneath. Croft was always waiting, his lantern casting monstrous shadows across the sagging walls. Their exchanges were silent, mechanical, devoid of pleasantries. She passed him the bundle. He passed her a purse heavy with silver. No names, no prayers, just business. But business has a way of becoming ritual. Croft began to study her not with suspicion, but with awe. He saw in her not merely a supplier, but a kindred spirit, someone who, like him, had transcended society's lies. They were not bound by morality, they were not bound by God, they were bound only by hunger and by the silver that fed it. Anora too felt the ritual grow. Every walk to the cabin was a pilgrimage, every exchange, a communion. Her cottage on the edge of town became her temple, a threshold between the world of daylight and the world of night. In the homes of the wealthy, she wore the mask of mercy. But in the forest, with silver in her pocket, she was something else, something truer. And the more she walked that path, the colder she became. She had started as a grieving mother, hardened by loss, consumed by resentment. But resentment had transformed into calculation, and calculation had ripened into enterprise. Now, she was not merely punishing the rich, she was feeding on them. She was running a business of death under the noses of an entire town, and the town was too blinded by trust to see. But Elias Vance was not blind. Every entry in his ledger deepened his conviction. Every column of deaths carved another notch in his certainty. The mathematics could not be ignored. Yet he knew, if he spoke too soon, if he accused without proof, he would be cast out, ridiculed, destroyed. The town would not turn on its angel. They would turn on him. So, he stayed silent. But his silence was not surrender. It was preparation. And as he prepared, Anora's mask was beginning to crack. Because whispers have gravity. They gather, they pull, they drag secrets into the light. The Pritchards whispered. The Winthrops whispered. And even the poorest families, the ones who adored her most, began to notice the strange divide. Why did their babies live, while the heirs of Providence Bluffs so often did not? Anora heard the whispers too. She saw the glances in the market, the lowered voices in the church pews. She knew the town's love could sour into suspicion at any moment, and so she tightened her grip on her mask. She redoubled her acts of charity. She prayed louder. She walked the streets with bread in her arms, blessing the poor, kissing the brows of their children. But every mask eventually slips, and when it does, the world does not see the angel, it sees the monster beneath. By the autumn of 1843, Elias Vance could no longer sit idle with his ledger of ghosts. Numbers had turned to voices in his head, whispering in the night, urging him to act. But action was dangerous. In Providence Bluffs, Anora Good was not just a woman, she was an institution. To accuse her outright would mean ridicule, exile, perhaps even ruin. So Vance began carefully. He did not confront. He tested. He asked subtle questions in hushed tones. "How many children have you delivered this season, Mrs. Good? Strange, isn't it, how the poorest households thrive so well under your care? Tell me, do you keep records of your work?" Her answers were always smooth, always couched in humility. She laughed softly, dismissed the idea of keeping ledgers. "The Lord alone counts such things, she'd say. She praised the strength of the poor, their resilience, their God-given vigor. And she mourned the wealthy, their children so delicate, so burdened by the luxuries of their birth." On the surface, it was perfect sense. But underneath, Vance heard the evasion. He saw the shadow of calculation in her eyes, the flicker of something colder than grief. And so, he watched her more closely. He lingered after births when he was called to consult, noting the faint chemical odors, the way Anora insisted on tending the newborns alone, the strange herbs she carried in pouches at her waist. He began to catalog the details not just of outcomes, but of methods, the peculiar tinctures, the whispered prayers, the patterns of her touch, and with each observation suspicion hardened into certainty. But while Vance circled closer to her truth, Anora was deepening her own rituals. Her partnership with Silas Croft had taken on the texture of religion. No longer were their exchanges mere business. Each delivery to the cabin had become a rite. Croft had begun carving symbols into the beams of the trapper's hut, sigils of death and anatomy, borrowed from old medical texts. Anora, once skeptical of such displays, began to accept them. She found comfort in them. Power. Together they gave names to their work. The walk through the forest became the passage. The exchange of silver became the sacrament. And the dead infants, wrapped in oilcloth, became the offerings. She did not call them victims. She did not call them children. To Anora, they were vessels. Flesh turned into coin, grief transmuted into power, and with every offering, she felt herself ascend. She no longer thought of herself as a grieving mother avenging her loss. That story had burned away. Now she believed she had been chosen, set apart by fate, by sorrow, by God himself. For what is a midwife but the hand of life and death? Was she not simply leaning harder into her divine role? To decide who entered the world and who did not was not sin. It was destiny, and she wrapped that destiny in layers of performance. To the poor, she was generous beyond measure. Deliveries at no cost, herbs given freely, cradling their babies with tenderness that seemed angelic. To the wealthy, she cloaked herself in solemnity, her voice a hymn, her hands folded in prayer when tragedy struck. She was everywhere at once, feeding the hungry, comforting the bereaved, whispering scripture in the pews of the town's church. Every act, every gesture, reinforced the mask. But masks strain with time. The whispers in town had grown into patterns of gossip. "Strange," some women murmured, "how the Cartwright baby and the Winthrop baby died in the same week, both under Anora's care." Others recalled the odd bitterness on the lips of their dead children, or the way Anora insisted on closing the nursery door. Even the minister, Reverend Hale, began to notice the dissonance. Too much praise, too many coincidences, too many tears surrounding the same woman's name. He did not speak it aloud, he dared not, but the seed of unease had been planted. And Anora felt it. She began to tighten her grip on the town through subtler means. Her prayers grew louder, her public charities more extravagant. She took in an orphaned girl, a silent waif she dressed and fed like her own. She sat by sickbeds through the night, holding the hands of the dying, whispering psalms until dawn. She made herself indispensable, because she knew when the whispers rose to accusations, she would not be standing alone. She would be standing on the shoulders of an entire town's gratitude. And yet, for all her careful maneuvers, for all her rituals and masks, she could not silence the one man who saw her clearly. Elias Vance's ledger had grown thick, its pages heavy with ink and names. Each line was a blade, and together they formed a weapon sharp enough to cut through her illusions. But Vance was not ready to strike. Not yet. He was waiting, watching, hearing not just numbers but evidence, physical proof that could not be denied. And while he waited, Anora Good continued her work, each death more brazen than the last, each offering carried deeper into ritual. The stage was set, the mask was cracking, and Providence Bluffs was balanced on the edge of revelation. By winter of 1844, Providence Bluffs had grown restless. The harvest was thin, the river froze early, and the graveyard filled too quickly. Yet through the hardships, one name remained untouchable: Anora Good. But not for Elias Vance. He had waited long enough. His ledger was not merely ink and suspicion anymore, it was a map of murder, a document that whispered louder than any sermon. And though he still moved with caution, he had decided it was time to test the strength of Anora's mask. The opportunity came with the birth of the Winthrop child. The family was wealthy, prominent, proud. Their mansion loomed over the town like a stone citadel, and their newborn son was their legacy, their heir. Anora Good was, of course, summoned to oversee the delivery, but Vance, under the pretense of consulting on the mother's condition, maneuvered his way into the room. He stood silently as Anora worked, his sharp eyes fixed on her every movement. He noted the way her hands lingered on the infant longer than necessary, the small pouch she kept close at her waist, the faint scent, bitter, almond-like, that clung to the air whenever she bent over the child. And when she whispered her prayer, Vance leaned close enough to hear, not scripture, but something else, lower, softer, a murmuring that slid past the ear like smoke. When the child survived the first night, Vance pressed his test further. He announced to the family that he would be staying on as physician for the newborn, to ensure its health through the fragile first weeks. It was a bold move, a direct encroachment on Anora's domain. Her face did not falter, but her eyes flickered, a shadow, quick and sharp, like a blade drawn in silence. For the next fortnight, Vance rarely left the Winthrop home. He fed the child himself, measured its pulse, watched it sleep. Anora, shut out of her usual rituals, grew restless. Her visits became shorter, her tone clipped, her smile tight. She was losing control, and for the first time she knew it. The Winthrop child thrived. It was proof, not enough for the town, not yet, but enough for Vance. He had shown himself that Anora's power was not divine, not fate, not God's will. It was method. It was poison, smothered in prayer. And when stripped of her solitude, her method failed. But proof in private was not the same as proof in public. He needed allies. So Vance began speaking in guarded tones to those who had whispered before, to Eleanor Pritchard, whose doubts had never died, to Reverend Hale, whose sermons had grown heavier with unease, to the blacksmith's wife, who had noticed the strange divide between the rich and the poor. He sowed seeds carefully, never naming Anora outright, but asking questions sharp enough to draw blood. And though fear sealed many mouths, suspicion grew teeth. Meanwhile, in the forest, Anora's rituals with Silas Croft reached a fevered pitch. The trapper's cabin was no longer merely a place of exchange. It had become a shrine. Bones hung from its rafters like wind chimes. Symbols carved into its beams glowed faintly with tallow from black candles. Croft had begun to speak of their work as destiny, a sacred mission to provide vessels for the march of science, for powers greater than the common world. And Anora, once reluctant, once calculating, now leaned into it with fanatic devotion. Each child she delivered to Croft was no longer just silver in her pocket. It was an offering, a ritual, a testament to her chosen place between life and death. Together they performed rites in the cabin. Croft chanting in guttural tones pulled from forbidden texts, Anora swaying, her hands dripping with the oil of herbs and blood. The dead infants were not merely traded, they were consecrated. Their silence turned into currency for both science and faith. Two hungers twined together in darkness, but rituals breed arrogance. Anora grew bolder, careless even. She lingered too long in wealthy homes. She pressed too quickly for solitude with newborns. And all the while, the whispers in Providence Bluffs were no longer just whispers. They were conversations, patterns noticed, questions asked aloud. Elias Vance felt the tide turning. He could not wait much longer. He had tested her. He had proven to himself what she was. But now, he would have to prove it to the town. And to do that, he needed something undeniable, not numbers, not whispers, but evidence no one could dismiss. Anora Good was careful. She had built her mask with skill, but even the strongest mask cracks when watched too closely. And Vance was watching. He was closer than ever, and she knew it. By early 1845, the silence of Providence Bluffs was cracking. The graveyard filled too fast, the whispers spread too far, and Elias Vance, ledger in hand, no longer moved like a man observing, he moved like a man hunting. He began to set his snares carefully, like a fox-catcher in winter. First came the herbs. Vance had noted the faint almond tang in the dead infant's cloths, the bitter smell that clung to Anora's hands. Cyanogenic compounds, he suspected, deadly, precise, easy to disguise as medicine. So he began collecting the remnants of her work. Strips of cloth, drops of tincture left at the bottom of her vials. Even the air of the nursery after she left. Each sample was hidden away, preserved, waiting for the moment he could present them as proof. Next came the records. Vance sought out midwives in neighboring towns, comparing outcomes. He charted infant survival rates across counties, building a grim mosaic of mortality. Nowhere else, in no other midwife's care, did the wealthy die so disproportionately. Only in Providence Bluffs, only under Anora Good. And finally came the watching. He placed himself where she least wanted him, beside the cradles of the rich, at the foot of their beds, on the benches of their nurseries. He refused to yield his post, refusing her the solitude she needed to perform her rites. And with each child who survived under his guard, the circle tightened. But Anora Good was no fool. She felt the noose drawing close. She saw Vance's eyes on her like lanterns in the dark. She heard the shift in the town's tone, the subtle doubt in voices that once sang her praise. The trust that had been her cloak was thinning. And when a mask begins to slip, one must act swiftly or risk being stripped bare. So Anora struck back. Her countermove was not poison, not ritual, not silver. It was character. She began to whisper in turn, only not about herself, but about Vance. Strange, she told the butcher's wife, how the doctor lingers so long with newborns, as though he cannot leave them. Odd, she told the minister's wife, how he prowls the nurseries at night, staring at the babes as they sleep. And to the grieving mothers she whispered, I've done all I could, but perhaps the Lord has seen fit to test us with this new physician. His ways are not always God's ways. Slowly, suspicion bent its head toward him. He was, after all, an outsider. A man trained in Philadelphia, speaking the language of numbers and science rather than scripture and fate. His ledgers, his samples, his endless watching, all of it could be made to look not like vigilance, but obsession, perversion, perhaps even malice. The town began to murmur in both directions now. Was Anora the angel she seemed, or was Vance the wolf who shadowed the cradles? It became a duel of stories, fought not with blades, but with whispers. And while the duel raged in the town's veins, Anora retreated deeper into ritual with Silas Croft. The trapper's cabin had grown grotesque with their ceremonies. Bones strung from the rafters, jars of preserved organs lined the shelves, infants' bodies wrapped in oilcloth lay stacked like firewood, awaiting their journey to distant medical halls. And in the center of it all, Anora stood like a priestess, her eyes alight, her voice low and fervent. This is not crime, she told Croft. This is calling. But Croft, practical as ever, began to grow uneasy. Anora's zeal had transformed what was once business into something dangerous, reckless. He dealt in bodies, not faith, and though he shared her hunger, he did not share her vision. The first fissure in their partnership had appeared. Back in town, Elias Vance felt the sting of her countermove. Mothers pulled their children from his arms, families hesitated when he offered his care, and though his ledger swelled with truth, truth means little when the world prefers lies. It was a stalemate now, Anora holding the town's heart, Vance holding the town's numbers. But stalemates cannot last. One act, one death, one crack in the mask would be enough to tip Providence Bluffs into revelation or ruin, and both of them knew it. The next birth would decide everything. The storm rolled in on the night of June the 1st, 1845. Lightning tore across the Cumberland sky, thunder shaking the foundations of Providence Bluffs. The streets emptied. Candles flickered in shuttered windows, and in the grandest house on the bluffs, the Cartwright estate, the cries of a woman in labor pierced the storm. It was the perfect stage. The Cartwrights were old money, wealthier even than the Pritchards. Their heir would be the most important child born in the county in a decade. Every eye in town was fixed on their house, waiting for news. And, in that chamber, two figures waited for the moment of truth. Anora Good, seated like a queen at the mother's side, her hands calm, her voice soft, her every movement rehearsed with the grace of ritual. She had delivered dozens of Cartwright children before, burying most of them in silence. To her, this room was hers, her altar, and across from her, standing with folded arms, ledger closed, eyes sharp as blades, was Dr. Elias Vance. He had refused to leave. He had insisted the Cartwrights allow him to attend, under the justification of modern oversight. But everyone in the room knew this was no courtesy. This was war. Hours passed. Sweat dripped. Candles guttered in their brass holders. The air thickened with the copper scent of blood and storm-soaked earth. At last, the child came, a girl, slick with birth, lungs strong enough to rattle the rafters. Relief swept the room. The mother wept, the grandmother prayed, the maids sobbed into their aprons. And then came the most dangerous moment in Providence Bluffs. Anora took the child in her arms. "Rest now," she murmured, as always. "I'll see to her." She turned her back, as always. To clean, to swaddle, to decide. But this time, Vance followed. He stepped into her corner, close enough to see the vial she had palmed from her satchel, close enough to smell the faint, bitter almond, close enough to hear the whispered words that weren't prayers at all, but incantations. "Stop!" His voice was a blade. "Hand me the vial." The room froze. Maids stiffened, eyes darting. The grandmother's rosary slipped between her fingers. Even the mother, pale and weak, lifted her head. Anora turned, mask still on her face, voice smooth as honey. "Doctor, this is a child's first bath. Are you so unlearned you'd interfere with a midwife's work?" But Vance did not flinch. He extended his hand, palm open, steady. "Hand it to me, or I swear to God, I'll show them all what you've done." A silence like death itself filled the chamber. Only the storm outside moved. Then Anora smiled, that slow, chilling smile. She placed the vial in his palm, but her eyes, those calm, endless eyes, never blinked. "Be careful, doctor," she whispered. "A man who plays with poison learns what it tastes like." The spell broke. The maids shifted uneasily. The grandmother muttered a prayer, and Vance, without another word, pocketed the vial and returned to his post. The baby lived that night. For the first time in years, an heir of wealth slept safely through the storm, but Anora's mask had cracked. Not fully, not yet, but enough. The Cartwright matriarch saw the tremor in her hands. The servants saw the vial. And Elias Vance knew he had only to press harder, cut deeper, before the whole rotten edifice collapsed. Anora left the Cartwright estate before dawn, cloak pulled tight, face pale as ash. For the first time in decades, she felt the ground beneath her shift. The whispers of Providence Bluffs were no longer only hers to control. She walked into the rain, but the storm did not wash her clean. It only carried her deeper into shadow. Because when masks slip, monsters grow desperate, and desperate monsters are the most dangerous of all. The storm had passed, but in Providence Bluffs the air was heavier than before. The Cartwright child's survival was spoken of as a miracle, though not in the way Anora intended. For decades, she had been the miracle worker, but now people whispered a new name in hushed voices, Dr. Elias Vance. The ledger keeper, the man who watched the midwife's hands, the one who stood in the shadows and blocked the angel's reach. For Anora Good, the shift was more than dangerous, it was deadly. She felt it in the market, when women who once offered her bread now gave only curt nods. She saw it in the church, when pews that used to part for her presence now remained closed. She heard it in the silence outside her cottage, the absence of footsteps that once came to beg her aid. Her cloak of trust was unraveling, and a redditor without its camouflage must either vanish or strike. That night she met Silas Croft in the rotting cabin by the river. The lantern light trembled as if it too feared what was coming. "They've begun to look at me differently," she said, her voice low, sharp. "Vance has poisoned them against me." Croft examined the bundle she had brought. The infant was small, the skin gray, the body already beginning to stiffen. He unwrapped it with mechanical precision, but his hands hesitated. For the first time, he looked not at the body, but at her. "You're drawing too much attention," he muttered. "This isn't the way. We had a balance, quiet, profitable. Now you're making it a crusade." Her eyes flashed. "A crusade? This is judgment. This is justice. These children are not theirs to keep, Silas. They are debts paid. And Vance, he threatens everything. He thinks numbers will save him. But numbers cannot measure the will of God." Croft said nothing. He only tied the bundle shut, his expression colder than the river outside. But in his silence, Anora felt the betrayal forming. He was no longer her partner. He was her liability. Back in town, Elias Vance was working his own quiet war. He began showing the vial to men of influence, the minister, the sheriff, the magistrate. He did not name it openly, but he let the bitter scent curl into their nostrils, let their imaginations do the work. "Have you noticed," he would say, "that the richest families bury their children most often? That Providence Bluffs is a town where gold buys you coffins, not blessings?" The men squirmed. Some looked away. Some muttered that infant death was God's will. But one or two listened, and in their silence Vance saw seeds taking root. Anora, meanwhile, turned to fear. She began visiting mothers late at night, offering them protective charms, whispering that Vance's modern medicine was unholy, that he bled women dry and tampered with God's plan. "Your child is safest with me," she told them, pressing talismans into their hands. "Do not let him near your cradles. He brings death where he goes." Some believed her, many did not. The town was splitting down the center, half clinging to the angel they had always known, half swayed by the doctor who refused to look away. But even in her desperation, Anora could feel her grip slipping. Her hands shook at births. Her eyes lingered too long on silver and lace. Her voice, once steady as stone, began to tremble like a cracked bell. The mothers noticed, the servants whispered. And worst of all, Eleanor Pritchard, still hollow from grief, began to speak. She told of the sound she had heard in the nursery that night, like a pestle grinding. She told of the bitter almond scent. She told of the look in Anora's eyes when she brought the swaddled corpse. One woman's doubt became another's courage, and doubt, once spoken aloud, spreads like fire. By midsummer of 1845, Providence Bluffs was no longer a town of grace and certainty. It was a place of suspicion, a theater of shadows where every family looked over their shoulder. Anora Good walked the streets still, but the air around her was different. Doors closed when she passed. Children pulled closer to their mother's skirts. And Elias Vance, he no longer needed to hunt in silence. The town itself was beginning to stalk the angel. The hunter and the hunted were trading places, and in her cottage, alone at night, Anora whispered to herself like a prayer, or perhaps a curse. "If they will not believe the angel, then they will learn to fear the monster." The heat of midsummer pressed down on Providence Bluffs like a hand on a throat. The river shrank, the air stank of rot, and tempers cracked under the weight of suspicion. By July, no one trusted their neighbor, their preacher, their healer. And then Providence Bluffs found its graveyard. It began with boys chasing a stray hog through the cedar woods beyond the river. They stumbled upon the trapper's cabin, Croft's den of trade. The hog had rooted at the base of the wall, dragging something pale from the mud. A hand, small, shriveled, unmistakably human. The boys screamed. Their fathers came running. And by evening, half the town had gathered, torches in hand, circling the rotted shack. Inside, Providence Bluffs saw what Elias Vance had only hinted at. Bundles stacked like cordwood, jars of flesh suspended in liquor, strings of bones swaying like wind chimes. The stench of rot and medicine and damp cedar. And among the filth, ledgers in Croft's hand, lists of bodies, dates, and names that matched too neatly with the infants laid to rest in fine family plots. The angel's miracles, laid bare as commerce. By nightfall, the sheriff had dragged Croft from his hunting camp, bound and snarling, swearing he only sold what was given, that it was Anora who delivered the bundles, that he was no killer, only a dealer, and the town believed him because his sins were squalid, ordinary, human. Hers was something else. Anora was fetched from her cottage at dawn. She walked to the square in silence, head high, cloak wrapped about her shoulders. Mothers wept. Fathers spat. The minister clutched his Bible so tightly the leather cracked. Only Elias Vance met her gaze without wavering. "You've hidden behind faith long enough," he said, his voice carrying over the square. "But the truth has teeth, and now it's bitten through." The sheriff opened one of Croft's bundles before the crowd. The stench rolled out. The sight was unbearable. A baby's body, mottled and half-decayed, still wrapped in the oilcloth of a wealthy house. A Pritchard child by the embroidered initials. Eleanor Pritchard collapsed where she stood. Gasps rose like a tide. Shouts followed. "Murderess!" "Witch!" "Devil's bride!" Stones clattered at her feet, but Anora did not bow. She lifted her chin, her voice slicing through the uproar. "You fool! Us, you blind, bleating fools! You think this is murder, this is offering, this is covenant. These children bought you your safety, your harvests, your peace. Do you think Providence Bluffs was spared the plagues and fires of the valley by chance? It was me, I held back the tide, and you dare curse me for it?" The crowd faltered, just for a breath, because some part of them, deep in the marrow, feared she spoke truth. Hadn't they prospered while other towns starved? Hadn't death always chosen the few so the many could live? But Elias Vance stepped forward, holding aloft the vial he had taken from her hands that stormy night. "This is no covenant, this is poison, and it ends here." The moment cracked like a bone. The sheriff seized her arms. The crowd surged. Torches thrust forward. The angel who had been their solace, their salvation, was swallowed now in curses and smoke. And yet, through the din, Anora laughed. Low, steady, terrible. "You think this is my end?" she hissed, eyes burning with something beyond madness. "No, Providence Bluffs. This is your beginning. You have torn the veil, and now you shall see what walks with me." The words fell like a curse over the square. Even bound, even dragged, Anora Good did not look like a woman defeated. She looked like a woman waiting for nightfall. The trial was swift. In a single day, Providence Bluffs turned decades of reverence into a scaffold. Testimonies spilled like blood in the dirt. Mothers, servants, even Silas Croft with his neck bruised from the sheriff's rope. Each word painted Anora not as angel, but as viper, wrapping the town in silken coils. The magistrate declared her guilty before sundown. By dawn, the gallows would bear her weight. That night, the town gathered in the square. Torches burned. The minister prayed so loudly his voice cracked. And there, bound in coarse rope, stood Anora Good. No tears, no pleas, only a calm so deep it unnerved even the sheriff who tied the knot. "You think this ends with my body," she said, voice ringing clear enough to reach every window in Providence Bluffs. "But I am stitched into this town. My blood is in your soil. My hands have touched every cradle. My whispers have brushed every ear. Kill me, and you do not cleanse yourselves. You inherit me." Her eyes swept the crowd. Mothers clutched their infants tighter. Men shifted on their feet. Elias Vance alone stood firm, ledger under his arm, jaw clenched like iron. The rope was cast. The trapdoor fell. Anora Good swung against the dawn. The crowd exhaled as one. Some wept. Some shouted thanks to God. Some spat on the dirt. The minister declared Providence Bluffs cleansed. Vance closed his ledger for the last time. The sheriff ordered the body buried beyond consecrated ground. But the town did not rest. That summer the cattle sickened. Fields browned under a sky that refused to rain. Infants died stillborn in numbers unseen since before Anora's reign. And at night, in the hush between thunder and silence, mothers swore they heard a woman's lullaby drifting through the trees. By autumn, when a child fell ill, the town no longer called for Elias Vance. They no longer called for any doctor. They whispered into the night, into the dark woods beyond the river, begging for the angel to return. And in the cedars, where moss grew thick around an unmarked grave, sometimes the earth seemed to breathe. Anora Good was gone, and yet Providence Bluffs still belonged to her.